watching Pressure Point. The Honourable David MacDonald is an ordained minister with the United Church of Canada. He, of course, has been a federal member of parliament and a cabinet minister, also ambassador to Ethiopia. During the Pinochet regime in Chile, he investigated human rights abuses, one of the founders of Vision Television, and has worked on parliamentary committees dealing with issues ranging from AIDS to the environment. And he is my guest. So welcome to you, David.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. It's been a rich life and just many,
I hope it's not over yet. I'm checking my wrist here.
That's good.
Right.
Well, okay, well, let's go back in your life. I just know that you were the youngest ever president of the United Church Youth Movement in the late 50s. And in 1961, you were ordained as a minister. I mean, you've done many things since then, but what was driving David MacDonald? What was inspiring David MacDonald then?
It'd be hard to get a single answer, but I suppose I've always been fascinated by what made society tick. I mean, that's a funny way of answering it, I guess, but growing up in Charlottetown, I'm from Prince Edward Island. People think I come from Toronto or Ottawa or some other place, but I actually grew up in Prince Edward Island. And one thing about growing up in PEI, the rumor is true. Virtually everybody knows everybody else. And you know, you can see the whole of society right in front of you. And I have, as you likely might gather, a tremendous sense of curiosity. And I tried to think out what's happening here, what's really important about what's going on, and where do I fit in it all. And in my earlier days, I guess I saw that particularly in this medium we're on right now, television, because in the 1950s, I worked as a disc jockey and later as a television host in a station that just went on the air 42 years ago in 1956. So I wanted to be participating in some way in things that would make a difference for people, that would be meaningful to me, but also meaningful to the community that I lived in.
So did you see the church as one of those ways?
I had a kind of love-hate sense of the church, quite frankly. I can remember as a very small child sitting in Trinity United Church in Charlottetown, looking at the minister and saying, the last thing in the world I'd ever want to be will be a United Church minister. And by golly, I ended up as a United Church minister. And then if I had a second choice of what I wouldn't want to be, I'd look at somebody who was in politics and say, that'd be a terrible thing to be a politician. I mean, now, I didn't have all the negative views that people have since developed in the last 40 years.
There are more negative views now.
It's gotten even worse, that's right.
But I mean, okay, so then you were there, you were working as a minister, and then you decided to enter politics. So what prompted that, given these sort of odd reactions? It's
a little easier to explain. When I finally got through studying for the ministry and was ordained a United Church minister and was sent to a 3-point rural charge in the western part of PEI, I realized that there were a lot of things happening in the community that weren't very good. Like there were a lot of young people simply on the streets. They didn't have enough to do. There were too many people who were unemployed. And I looked around for people who might want to work on some of these things. And the person that I found most willing to do it was a Roman Catholic priest. And this was pretty unusual stuff in the early 1960s, a priest and a United Church minister. And we were organizing co-ops, we were organizing dances for young people, we were building a hockey rink. And at the end of all this, somebody came to me and said, you know, you're a pretty interesting community, why don't you go into politics? And when they said the first time, I said, why would I do that? And then when they kept asking me the question, and when Pearson called the election in 1965, I was pretty well ready to say yes, okay, I'll do this.
So you were in politics then from 65 for decades, really.
Seemed like forever, that's right.
But it was. I mean, when you look at your resume, a long time.
Yeah.
Very fortunate. I mean, not many politicians are able to, you know, serve for that length of time. How did your expectations of the difference that you could make jive with the reality?
Well, this is sort of a good news, bad news story. I had a lot of things that I thought I could do overnight, you know. Like I was involved in community development, working with fishermen on the East Coast. I thought, I can see some of the things that need to happen here, so I can go right up there to Ottawa and tell them what they've got to do. Well, of course, it doesn't work out that way. You're up against a lot of other people and a lot of other pressures. But I think I learned as time went on that you looked for allies, you looked for people who shared some of the same concerns, some of the same fears or hopes that you had, and then you tried to work with them. Now the interesting thing was they weren't all in your party, and I sometimes got into trouble because I would find people in the other political parties who wanted to work at these same issues, and I found it a very effective device, actually, if you could have, you know, myself as a member of the Progressive Conservative Party and somebody else in the Liberal Party or somebody else in the NDP, and we all came together and we said, here's something we want to change, something we want to work on. And if the three of us agreed on it, that can be pretty potent.
I suppose that's ideal, isn't it, really, when you can get people...
Cross-party support.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think it's more difficult today because I think that the divide between the various political parties is greater, and the sense of suspicion and distance is not very good. And generally speaking, people have a lower regard for people accomplishing something worthwhile in public life, which I think is unfortunate because then it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe that people aren't going to do anything very worthwhile, they likely won't.
So which came first? Did that general perception come first, or was it a disappointment and disillusionment with politicians? Because, I mean, you mentioned Pearson, and I remember thinking that Lester Pearson was just, you know, the best. Don't have that same feeling for our contemporary Prime Minister.
I think it's a much tougher world today. I think since the 80s, there's an odd situation that's developed. There were certain things that were given that were never going to go away. The Cold War was never going to go away, you know. The kind of arrangement of the world as we knew it was going to go on almost indefinitely. And I think that has ended. And I think that there was a certain willingness to believe that public institutions could continue to do good if we continue to work at them. And one doesn't like to use this word, and I certainly don't use it with respect to my own views, but I think there grew a very large-scale amount of cynicism about what could be done, and a kind of alienation from the public process, from the political process. And we may be almost at the end of that. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic or hopeful about this, but I think that for the last 15 to 20 years, we have kind of given up on what I would call is the notion of a good society, and I think we have, like everything else, we've privatized it, and that's been very destructive.
But what signals the shift for you then, if you think we're almost at the end? I mean,
I think that there was a kind of belief that somehow or other individuals on their own, people taking care of their own individual interests, would in the end find themselves in a better situation. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think that people realize that we're all in this together, and that the kind of privatization of life, the kind of individualization of life, this is a mug's game. Nobody ultimately benefits from that, you know. Now that's a big learning.
So now does that explain your shift from having been a progressive conservative for most of your life and in the last election running as an NDP candidate?
It's possible.
That's a pretty big shift.
That was a major shift.
Seems to go against the stream.
That was like an earthquake. Well, maybe in my own personal case it wasn't so much because I was known from almost the beginning as a Red Tory. But I think what happened in the 80s, and it was all part of that sort of lurch or shift to the right, and particularly after the '93 election, when the Tory party was literally shelled out of existence, and then you had the dramatic replacement of Reform, and Reform represented itself as a kind of conservative party. I don't think it really is. It's kind of a collection of people who are almost against any form of government, in my view at least, and I think what you ended up with was the shell of a conservative party, which, trying to scramble to find some ground, moved significantly to the right. And I just felt totally uncomfortable in that situation. Now, it'll be interesting to see what happens with you know, a leader like Joe Clark coming back, because I was a very strong supporter of Joe Clark's and very much a part of his whole building of the party in the 1970s. But
what do you think will happen? I mean, do you think that
well,
the progressive conservatives can come back?
I think that's the great question. They have several very large obstacles that we did not face. First of all, the two main provincial Tory governments that exist, the Klein government in Alberta and the Harris government in Ontario, are basically more manifestations of the Reform Party than they are of the traditional Progressive Conservative Party. And so that makes it very difficult for Clark. And I think the other thing is that they have this legacy of the '93 defeat, which is best epitomized in a $10 million debt, and an organization that I think is still relatively shell-shocked. Now, there's a lot of good people still in the Tory party, and many of them will try to rebuild the party, and that may happen. I don't know. It's going to take a considerable effort because you've got an enormous vacuum right now. You have the Liberals in government.
With no opposition.
With
no viable opposition.
With an alternative opposition. I think, the big word is the alternative. Preston Manning talks about the United Alternative, and Joe is now talking about the Canadian Alternative. Well, whatever it is, I think people are saying to themselves, there's got to be some kind of an alternative. And, now that I'm an active NDPer, I work to try to develop an NDP alternative. But
the left,
nobody's moved in.
The left has not sort of risen to the challenge either, has it?
Well, what's interesting about it, I don't think it's much longer a left-right issue, because I think the things that are of concern are not really defined
by ideology?
But not by those kind of ideologies. No. I mean, if you want to know, from my point of view, what the most important issue is, I think the most important issue is, can we build a modern society which will survive in environmental terms? I spend a lot of my time these days working on and thinking about environmental issues.
Because you chaired a parliamentary committee on the environment.
I chaired the committee for 4 or 5 years. I worked in the Earth Summit. I now teach environmental ethics at Concordia University in Montreal. And I know that people I deal with, young people, young men and women in their teens and 20s, the issue is what kind of a world is it going to be like when they get to be an old guy like me?
I mean, having done research and talked to many people, what's your sense? What are scientists saying? What do people think?
Well, I know what the scientists are saying, and I think I know something about what people think. The problem is big institutions, whether it's corporations or governments, are still plugged into an old kind of industrial capitalist economy, which is antithetical to any kind of sustainable society. I mean,
that's right.
And the question is, can these? It's sort of like the parable or modern equivalent of the dinosaurs. Can these dinosaurs do something in order to change or die or get out of the way in order that the planet will survive?
The other thing is that what motivates change? I mean, what prompts change? And do we always wait to change until it's too late? Or in this case, could it be too late when we realize we have to change?
This is a really fascinating question. And I remember when I was in Africa dealing with a number of situations, people would say, well, you can't do anything about that until it gets worse. And that's a bit of a mistake, because sometimes when it gets worse, you can even do less. I still believe that we're reasonably intelligent human beings. And I think that when the penny finally drops and people say, hey, wait a second, what are the priorities? Are they something to do with water that's safe to drink, with air that is going to be livable? As people get more and more allergies, as the ozone layer gets thinner, as land becomes so toxic that we can't grow any fruit or vegetables, there's going to be a point, and I think sooner rather than later, people saying, we do something about that.
But what about the power of the corporation?
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line, the profit, the stockholder, all of those things. I mean, the heads of all the corporations right now could suddenly, the penny could drop, and they'd be out like that.
Yeah. But
so where will the collective will come from?
These are human creations.
Right.
I mean, corporations haven't been around for 5,000 or 20,000 years. The modern day corporation is a pretty recent phenomenon, and I cannot believe that with a certain amount of intelligence and knowledge that we cannot say to ourselves, this isn't working very well. We need institutions that are more attuned to the kind of world we're really living in. And it may be that people in their 50s and 60s, the kind of people that I grew up with, are not going to get the message. But I have to tell you, The people today who are in their 20s and 30s, my daughters and my son and others of that age group, I don't think they have much tolerance for this kind of total denial that older people live with. You know, so when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, I don't think it necessarily relates to a crisis. I think it relates to, let me give you an example, and it's a good one, I think. If you'd asked me 10, 12 years ago, would it be possible that we would ban smoking outright in virtually all public buildings, all public transportation in this country, and do it almost overnight? I would have said, you got to be kidding. Everybody likes to smoke. We do smoking as much as we eat or breathe. And yet, just think of how quickly it became totally unacceptable to smoke in most public places. And it happened overnight. Yeah. Now, the tobacco companies are still fighting it. Right. And they're still trying to find other ways to get people to use the product. But in fact, we've set a different standard in this country and in other countries, and that's only, I think, the tip of the iceberg. And
if it can happen there, it can happen in other ways.
I think
but
so.
I think you're right to say the tobacco companies are still fighting it, so it will never be a complete, you know, there'll always be that tension.
There'll always be some backwater somewhere. But I think the significant shift of mainstream society will go in another direction.
And we've certainly seen historically in the last 10 years, I mean, from the Soviet Union to Germany, South Africa, I mean, we've seen that things can happen so quickly.
There are two examples that I think can give any of us great hope. One is the end of apartheid in South Africa. The other is the end of the Cold War. Again, if it had been about, well, a little more than 10 years ago now, say 12, 15 years ago, we'd had this interview and you'd say, is it possible in the next decade the Cold War would come to an end, that apartheid would come crashing down? I would have said, you got to be kidding. I mean, these things are entrenched. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to keep these systems in place. So why would they end overnight? There's a certain sense in which they become almost politically ridiculous. You say, what are we doing here? This makes no, who's gaining from this? And it's just like the emperor has no clothes. People just wake up and say, that's right, we got to make a change.
Well, I mean, speaking of that, you were investigating human rights abuses in Chile during the Pinochet regime. Yeah, yeah. And in 1998, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, I read that for many human rights activists, him having to face trial is one of the highlights in the past 50 years. Yeah. Comments, because you were one of the first-hand observers.
Well, not only was I an observer, but Pinochet went on national television in '76 to deliberately say that another colleague and myself could not come to Chile because we were so much enemies of his regime and of what was happening in Chile at that time. I think that, I don't know whether there is a direct connection between what's happening to Pinochet today and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but what I do know is this, that I think that people are saying to themselves, doesn't matter what position you hold, if you are abusing power, at some point you're going to have to own up to that. And it doesn't matter, you know, it is true I think that nation states are a lot less powerful today. And the fact is that Pinochet is having to accept his responsibility not in Chile, but in Great Britain and in Spain. I mean, in this way, the world is much closer to being one.
A global village.
It is the kind of Marshall McLuhan's global village, it's true. And I think that is the interesting thing, that in fact, you run, but you can't hide. And I think that's what Pinochet's experience is turning out to be.
Another aspect of your life and career, ambassador to Ethiopia, and prior to that, you were Canada's African famine coordinator.
Right. Yeah.
Describe that experience and how it changes you.
Well, it was a pretty profound experience. I took on the responsibility in '84 to help Canada formulate its response to an incredible famine situation in Africa. There were as many as 30 million people who at one stage were seriously at risk of starving to death. And what was interesting to me is that this is one of those special times when, in fact, the public trusted government, trusted one another, trusted their organizations, and everybody worked together in an amazing collaboration. In the experience of the African famine in Canada alone, virtually every third Canadian got involved in some fashion. And that's unusual to take that kind of interest in something that was halfway around the world. And everybody got involved, including people who lived in the most remotest parts of this country. I went up to the high Arctic to talk to some people in Panjurtung, which is right on the edge of the Arctic Circle. They had emptied the coffers of their village treasury to send money off to Ethiopia. And I said to the elders, I said, how could you possibly, living in the high Arctic, identify with people living halfway around the world in Ethiopia? And one of the elders looked at me and he said, Mr. MacDonald, we live in the cold desert. We know what it is to face starvation and famine. And these were our brothers and sisters living in Ethiopia, and we wanted to do anything we physically could to help. So there was that kind of identification. And when I went to Ethiopia later as ambassador, I found a tremendous interest on the part of pretty well all Canadians in not just responding to a famine, but saying, how do we help people ever get into that situation again? Now that's the tougher question. It's because we have such amazing productivity in this country, we can put together all kinds of wheat and food products and medical supplies. What we're not as good at, and we're still wrestling with this one, is how do we work with countries to prevent getting into the situation of a famine? Now, that's the challenge for the next few years. I tried at the end of my mandate to say, here are a bunch of things I think we can do, and we've responded to some of them a little bit, but there's a lot more we need to do.
So looking ahead, what do you see Africa's future? I mean, Africa, not just Ethiopia, but Africa has certainly got a tremendous challenge. I mean, there's AIDS, you sat on the AIDS committee, and just epidemic. Generations being wiped out, famine, war.
The greatest problem for Africa still today is that it still suffers from a kind of colonial legacy in which they are, even though they became politically independent in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, economically they remained heavily dependent on their former colonial masters, and these are mostly European, though some are the North American. And I think the only real long-term economic, political, and social hope for Africans is that they take more and more responsibility in their own countries, and to some degree, and this is not entirely a happy thought, I think almost cut off some of the relations that they have, particularly with their former colonial masters. Now, it's a little like the Chinese solution. I mean, China, in order to break free, ultimately had to go it alone and go into kind of isolation. It would not be as easy for Africa to do that.
And it would be choosing tremendous suffering, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure the suffering would be much greater than what they're presently experiencing, quite frankly, because I think that there are 25 to 30 sub-Saharan African countries that are living on the edge. I mean, but I think that unfortunately we keep them in such a situation of dependency, and that has not really ended even to this day.
I guess, do we want that to change?
Well, that's a tough question.
I mean, in the first world, in Canada, the United States, Europe, and so on?
I think there's a good deal of ambivalence about that, unfortunately. I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but I don't think there is one at this stage.
Oh. So we began the program with you saying, in 1958, 1960, and you wanted to see how society ticks, and you became a United Church minister.
That's right.
Where would you see it now, and also does your faith play a role in that perspective?
Yeah, I think that what's happened is my faith has, if one can put it this way, has evolved in concert with my political growing up. I am, if I can put it this way, I think I'm more radical today than I was when I started, which is interesting because most people say when you get older you become more
you're supposed to be really radical when you started, and you
well,
sort of
in my case, I think it's gone the opposite direction, and
But that's okay. I mean,
well, I hope it's okay. I mean, I can't do much about it. That's what's happened, and I think that I am theologically much more radical and tougher than I was when I was younger.
Say, what does tougher mean?
Well, tougher means that I think that some of the answers I saw to the tough questions were more superficial and perhaps a little more pleasant to contemplate, and I think that as I've gotten older, I've become somewhat stronger in my views that our society has a lot of catching up to some of the theological rhetoric that we tossed about very easily, but didn't take maybe as seriously as we needed to. So my heroes, if this is any help, are people who, some of whom struggled in the 1930s against the rise of fascism in Europe, because I think that there are elements of what one of my theological heroes calls soft fascism that exist in our society. And I think we have to deal with those. Some of them, unfortunately, became very visible after the end of the Cold War. And I said earlier, I think that maybe we're at the end of that. I hope we're at the end of it. But some pretty ultimately self-destructive things surfaced in our society that we have to come to terms with. So I guess in that sense, I've always been a questioner, and I don't think that's diminished very much. And I see a much, perhaps more of an integration between my faith beliefs and my sort of political life. I was getting off the plane a couple of days ago, and I heard the flight attendant say, the worst thing in the world is to ever try and have a discussion about politics and religion. And I kind of laughed, and I said, I spend most of my time exploring both of those.
And I think it's been terrific being able to talk with you. And I agree, we should never stop asking questions.
Yep.
Right? Thanks, David, for being my guest. I've been talking with the Honourable David MacDonald, and we've been talking about faith and politics and his life and our society. Thanks for joining us on Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe.